Hello and welcome to Northcountry Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women and one of the civic partners for this show. Today we are hosting a conversation with Tom Burns, the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES School Superintendent, about the New York State Common Core standards. Joining us today is Ann Carvill, an education blogger. Tom, welcome back to Northcountry Matters. You are one of our most frequent guests and one of our favorite. In previous shows, we've talked about the Common Core standards, trying to understand what they are and the ups and downs of their implementation over the last year plus, and how BOCES has been really assisting teachers in schools to use them effectively and to improve the education that our students are receiving. When we listen to the news these days, particularly the political news, one would think that the Common Core standards belong on the post office wall on a wanted dead or alive poster. It's a sure bet that if this year's election had been held last year, the Common Core would have come in laying over the back of a horse behind the posse because of how much noise there is about them. But we have an opportunity today to take a longer view than politicians often take when it comes to things like the standards, to see where they could lead us. A few months ago, you led a field trip of some BOCES personnel and some school folks to schools in Ontario, Canada. Tell us who went on that trip and where you went.
Yeah, we had been wanting to do it for quite a while, and so we finally connected with a school district across the border. It was the Ottawa-Carleton School District Board, and so we made some arrangements. They were very gracious. They were great hosts, and we've struck up, I think, quite a partnership now. So we brought a handful of school superintendents and some Board of Education members, and some of my BOCES staff, and we were able to do 2 full days, and really 2 of the best professional days I've had in a long time. We learned a ton. And,
what were you hoping to find out? What motivated the whole trip, Tom?
Really going into it, when I looked at it, I've seen consistently high performance from Canada the last 10 or 15 years on international tests and benchmarks. When you look at what they're spending on education per pupil and the value that they receive back, that's very high. That intrigued me. They have been able to achieve, I think, a greater degree of equity across their system, equity of opportunity in programming for students. That interested me. And also they have regional high schools, which we've talked about. They've structured themselves differently than we have. And so those 4 things in particular, we really wanted to get over there and see that.
And that's really, that equity of opportunity has really been a problem that we struggle with here in New York State, because we don't have students across the broad spectrum of the state in the same kinds of schools with the same kind of facilities and the same kind of resources. So finding the Common Core is really meant to leverage some of those differences by making sure that the same opportunity is given to them academically, correct?
Yes, I think they've approached it from both sides of the fence. They've approached it, as you pointed out, from a programmatic standpoint. What kinds of courses and how rigorous should it be, and all students in Ontario should receive that. They also went about that, and they started this process in the mid-90s on the operational side. So in approximately 1996, the Ministry of Education in Ontario, in conjunction with the government, this is a notable difference, I think, to what we're experiencing now too, is that the government worked hand in hand with the Education Ministry, and they said we're going to streamline and standardize the curriculum and the curriculum frameworks, but we're also going to infuse more money into the system, and we're also going to reorganize the system, and they did some consolidating. So the Ottawa-Carleton School District itself, those were 2 separate districts, and in 1998 they were merged. So prior to that, it had been the city of Ottawa and the outlying areas in Carleton. So that's a school system now that is about 72,000 students, 150 schools. We were very impressed with their school district in particular. But they went at it, from two different ways. The other notable thing they did is to remove school funding from the local level to the provincial level.
So no property tax base anymore?
Not at the local level.
Not at the local level,
They took the school funding equation out of it at the local level, moved it to the provincial level.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't have time on this last visit. We were visiting schools. So we didn't sit down with the folks at the district level and at the Ministry of Education. That'll be another visit, another excuse to get back over there, because we really would like to see how they do that funding specifically from a province-wide level.
Now, you've mentioned that they do the regional high school model. Now, I'm assuming what they do is localized elementary schools,
Yes.
where students live in the community, and then slightly larger, like
Yes.
middle school type schools, right?
Correct,
Okay.
middle and high schools, yes.
Okay.
And their Catholic schools are part of their public education system.
Same standards, same set of
Yes.
expectations and curricula then?
Yes, so there are
Okay.
regional high schools and Catholic high schools.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Tom, during their process, did they run into the kinds of problems that our country and our state maybe specifically are running into with having a common set of more rigorous standards?
Mhm, They did. The principals and teachers that we spoke to, numerous times, you could see their eyes light up, and they would say to us, "We were there. We were there."
We walked a mile in those shoes. Huh?
So they were able to identify at many different junctures. Yep, we went through that. We were there, and stick with it. Here are some things that worked for us. These were the ways we got over some of those hurdles. The interesting thing too is how this all got started over there. So when you think about, you mentioned some of the backlash to the Common Core, and we're certainly getting a backlash around standardized testing and too much testing. Now those are federal requirements. That's probably a whole nother show.
Yeah,
Those
right.
really aren't tied in directly to the Common Core. I mean, the new test will be aligned to the Common Core standards, but it wasn't the implementation of those standards that resulted in or affected the amount of testing we do. That's already,
That's an old problem.
yeah, that's a No Child Left Behind
Right. Yeah.
issue. But what really interested me was this got started in the mid-90s in Canada because parents and public officials and educators in Ontario were concerned that rural students were not getting the same opportunities and the same level of rigor as kids in, say, Toronto. So they actually initiated it.
Nice.
It came from the grassroots that there's not enough coursework, or this is not rigorous
Or
enough.
our schools just can't afford to give the same level of opportunity that we are certainly seeing here in New York State.
That's
in
right.
the poor and urban districts compared to some of the suburban ones.
So I think, Ann, to go back to your point, we are seeing, for example, a lot of similarities with their experience and our experience. Of course, they experienced it 10 or 15 years ago. For example, their teachers didn't initially trust their new tests.
Right.
And I think that's natural anytime you do standard setting and you develop new curricula and new tests, and the first couple of years the teachers are going, I'm not so sure about this test. Does it align to the curriculum? Does it reflect what we're actually teaching? So that's just one example. But I just thought it was very interesting that we were at opposite ends of the spectrum on the issue of rigor and why we need common standards and perhaps common curriculum. I think they came at it from a very different angle, and we're seeing now pushback to the rigor. These new tests are harder. It's a more difficult curriculum to teach, and so people are now, they're talking to their legislators and different folks and saying, this is too hard, or slow it down, or my child is struggling too much, whereas they were saying, my child isn't struggling enough. They're not being challenged enough, and we're worried about how they're going to compete with kids in Toronto or kids in Finland or whatever.
Tom, was it a pushback to the rigor in our state and country, or is it a pushback to the assertion by many that the curricula was not properly in place before the tests. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
why take a hard test when you haven't been taught the material?
Yeah, I think there were pieces of all of that in there. You know, the last thing you just stated, that's been a big part of it, is that you implemented this too poorly, too quickly. We need more time, phase it in. You know, the legislators and the state ed department have made some of those adjustments now. I mean, the first graduating class that is going to be truly Common Core will be the class of 2022. So they are slowing that down and implementing those exams as the kids move through the system. Some of those concerns were valid. Yeah.
Tom, a question for you. You had a chance to talk with the teachers at the schools up there. How do you think the curriculum standards that they have compare to our Common Core? In other words, is what they implemented where we want to go? And if we allow our Common Core to go to completion and spend the time we need to implement it properly and fully, we'll be in the same place they're at with rigor?
You know, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Canada, and really not just Canada, I mean, there are several other nations that, by the way, are above us on the food chain when we look at the PISA or the other international benchmark. They are doing better than we are, and they have nationalized standards and curriculum. And
so that seems to be a common factor in their successes, you think?
It does, and you know, Ann and I are big fans of Mark Tucker, and Mark always pulls out these common denominators, and that is one of the pieces that he pulls out is a common, rigorous curriculum. That it does seem to be a factor in not just Canada, but many of these countries. And you know, you do understand the challenges of, you know, we do have quite a history of federalism in the United States, the different layers and states being reserved the right to govern education. But, you know, you have obvious problems when you leave it to 50 states to come up with their own curricula and assessments and rigor levels, and we've experienced that, you know.
I actually just had Carol McCoy, who's the president of Jefferson Community College, in the studio just before we met, and that was one of the questions I put to her, because she's seeing students from all over the country through the Fort Drum experience, and she said, yes, we're seeing people come in with all kinds of math skills, all kinds of reading skills, and it really is a function of, you know, where they've gone to school before that. There is nothing common. So she's certainly a fan of seeing a more rigorous and a more standardized level of educational expectation, because it will mean when people come to her college, they're going to be more successful from the get-go. There will not be as much remediation as they're having to do now with some students.
You know, I should go back, though, and address more specifically your original question, you know, in terms of the students with the curriculum, you know, and how specific that is. So I should back up, and you know, they are just standards at this point in the United States. You know, the Common Core are the learning standards. It's what students should know and be able to do. In those other countries, it is a curriculum. So I just felt like I should, you know, make that distinction. With
because
us,
they've had time to move forward in that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the United States, it is still up to the local boards and the local school districts to establish curriculum. But you know, when you ask that specific question, you know, what did it look like? The elementary classrooms that we were in Ontario, the math curriculum in particular looked very similar to the Common Core, what was in the Common Core standards, very similar. And again, I think you alluded to, so should we stick with it? Is that the right course to be on? When you look at Canada's results and those other nations, and specifically at their math results, because there's been a lot of pushback to you know, Common Core and the different way that we approach mathematics instruction. Again, they started this in the mid-90s, and when you look at their results, I don't see any evidence to suggest why we should divert ourselves from that path or not continue working in that direction. And that's what they said to us repeatedly. Stick with it.
They've produced several generations now of students who've gone through the entire curricula and then gone on to higher education and into the workforce. So the evidence is definitely there that it's been a successful process for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they're still refining too.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
it's
Well, as
constantly
we would
evolving.
hope.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, Tom, you mentioned Mark Tucker, and he's got a good blog that's worth reading, but one of the things he said, and I wondered if it was analogous up in Canada, that he was saying that one of the things we need to do is attract the higher performing or capable high school students to get into schools of education, and then schools of education need to have a far more rigorous training program. I was wondering, is that something that you, A, agree needs to happen in this country, and B, did they find in Canada that they needed to up the training of teachers as well?
Okay, that's an interesting question. This goes back to a couple of minutes ago when we were talking about Tucker pulling out these common denominators in these high-performing countries. That is, in fact, another one, is the quality of the teacher preparatory programs in these countries. There is some evidence to suggest that we have too many teacher prep programs and that we do need to look at that and look at the quality there. Interesting comments when we were over there and talking to them is they were very forthright with us that getting into a teacher ed program in Canada is roughly the equivalent. It's nearly as difficult as getting into medical school. So I think that answers your question about, you know, you've got to make these programs rigorous. You have to ramp up the entrance requirements, as you alluded to in your question. And then the other interesting piece is they had, I'm not going to recall the term, but it's basically teachers that complete the program and are not employed go into a pool. I guess it's almost like a long-term substitute pool, and then they're filtered into the system. So they, you know, in addition to the difficulty of getting into a program, the rigor of the program, they finish the program, then many of the teachers don't go directly into the classroom. They go into this pool and they gain additional experience and, you know.
So kind of almost like on-the-job training without being employed on the job, so to speak. But you're getting a taste of different classrooms. You're working in different school settings. You're getting the opportunity to observe a lot of this stuff in a practical way without being thrown into the deep end of the water.
Like an apprenticeship of sorts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly.
And they did tell us, and you know, I don't have any data. I don't know how many people they're talking about, and you know, I'm loath to admit it, et cetera. But you know, they did tell us that some of their candidates that are not admitted into their programs in Canada come over here.
Interesting. Now, do they also up the income for teachers who have to pass tests as rigorous as medical school admission?
We asked them that. It appears to be about the same. I didn't, you know, you're comparing currencies and et cetera, and cost of living. But we did have that conversation with them, and it looked pretty similar. Yeah.
You know, one of the questions that I have for you, Tom, your colleague, Steve Todd, who has been a guest on our show, and in fact will be here next week, in his new guise as the superintendent of the Jefferson Lewis BOCES, he has said to us before that he doesn't think it's so much a case of not being enough money in education, but the money that we have in education is not being properly allocated and spent. How did the Canadian schools that you visited allocate their resources? What did you find in terms of how they prioritize their spending, and does that affect their results in the classroom?
Yeah, I think so. You know, spending always reflects priorities. And, you know, and Ann will recall this from her school board days, you know, I think when superintendents and school board members in this state sit down to put the budget together, you know, what you figure out at the end of the day is that you might have 15% of that budget that you can actually impact. You know, the rest is legislatively or otherwise through regulation or through the department. It's
Contracts.
yeah, labor contracts, you know, fixed costs with energy and facilities. You have very little control over that. But I think if you look hard in any school district, and we saw this over there, is you do see that their spending reflects their priorities. And I think what was most noticeable to us were their facilities. Their facilities were, their classroom spaces were very nice. They were, you know, bright, a lot of natural light. But, you know, I don't want to say they were draconian, but they weren't over-designed or overbuilt. There weren't a lot of extras. You know, when we went through the elementary school, for example, you know, they had kind of a step where, you know, students could set their boots, and these very utilitarian, just, you know, like rows of hooks. It looked like they came from IKEA. So you could see the cost efficiency, and I think that demonstrates, you know, we're not going to put a lot of money into expensive lockers or things. You know, there was a stairwell at either end of the hall. And when we stepped out into the stairwells, you know, you had to open the fire doors to go out into either stairwell. It was concrete with a metal railing. So, you know, to me, everything about their facilities said the money is going to go towards instruction. And if it's not about instruction, then it's you know,
Low priority.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's extra. And so I just found that to be very interesting. You know, the principal did mention to us at one of the schools that even though there is a lot of equity in their system, you know, she still didn't feel as though, you know, some of the poor children were getting enough. So, I mean, I think there's a degree of that in any system.
And part of it is just how the preparation a student has when they come to school as a kindergartner or as a first grader, and that's something the school can't have a lot of impact on. Tell us, you said you visited an elementary school. About how many students did that elementary school actually serve? Just kind of give us a sense of what school size was.
The first elementary school we visited was Rock Carrier, which was named after a local children's author. It's in Canada on the west side. It was a real growing neighborhood. It looked like a fairly suburban neighborhood. There was housing still going up. And that particular elementary school had over 700 students the previous year. And when we visited it, it was down to about 677 or so. In fact, they'd gotten so large at that school, there were trailers outside. A lot of the kids were in the module classrooms like we used to see at Indian River. And,
Yeah, we used to see that at Potsdam 40 years ago.
Yeah. And so it had gotten so large there, I think, because of the growth in housing, et cetera, that they had to redistrict. I found that interesting also. So within this very large, you know, now combined school district, it sounds to me, on a fairly regular basis, they redistrict kids to different elementary schools. And so again, they siphoned off about 50 students or so to make it more doable.
Tom, you mentioned earlier that when you walked into one of the classrooms, it was a little hard to find the teacher, and you made some good points about that. Would you explain a little bit about what you meant?
Yeah, it was very striking. We often have this conversation here in the States about you know, teacher-centric versus student-centric classrooms. And Ann and I were chatting before the show, and we went into several elementary classrooms, and we had to look to find the teacher. We couldn't see the teacher initially. And they were very student-centric classrooms and activities that they were working on. The kids were very actively engaged. They were mostly working in groups, small groups. But the kids were working and leading the activities. And you know, several classrooms we went in, we did finally look, and the teacher was off to the side, sitting with one of the small group, but not leading, not directing the instruction from the front of the classroom as we grew up and we were accustomed to. And there might have even been a lectern and straight rows. And that suggests a lot about how the activities are structured and how the learning is taking place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The old industrial model of sitting in rows and being passive and quiet is not for this century.
Well, and there's a reason for that, because of course a lot of our educational practices and certainly our organization comes from the 19th century. I mean, we still have the summers off so kids can go home and hay, but of course they're not really going home and hay. So there's definitely some structural things that we should be looking at, and certainly Canada's not that far away, and if they've got some good ideas, that's a great place for us to start getting some of those ideas.
I was going to say, Tom, one of the things that concerns me with regards to politicians is how quickly they can jump ship on a good idea. And we all know that the Common Core came about because of the governors across this country and because the Council of Chief State School Officers. And so it was a bipartisan effort, and it was hugely supported by them. And you support the Common Core standards, right? And what most of us seem to know is that the implementation went wrong, but the standards are good. Do you see our politicians supporting these standards? Because I listened to an ad the other day for a politician who's looking to be elected locally who was against the standards. So where do you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would ask that candidate is, have you read the standards? Do you know what is in the standards? As you pointed out, it's all about implementation. I think we saw some movement from initial criticism if people were opposed to the standards. Once they were presented with the standards or had to read the standards or understand that the standards are not in fact curriculum, then when the pushback receded on that, they moved very quickly to, well, there's poor implementation. And sometimes I think we let people get off a little easy with that term. Well, what do you mean by that? Which parts of the implementation went poorly? We talked earlier about the pacing. That's a valid concern. Okay, we can slow down the pacing, or we can phase this in over a number of cohort groups, but we need to know that, what the specific issues are. I think, Ann, we have a branding issue to some degree. I saw a document last week, and I didn't bring it with me, but there are many states now that are simply calling them something else because people have just, it's just a terminology problem. They've just, it's taken on such a negative connotation that they hear Common Core, and again, they might not have read the standards or know what the standards are, but they're just automatically opposed. So some states are actually I think Iowa is calling it the Iowa Core, just to give the impression that there was local input, and I don't think they're giving the impression. I don't think there was.
And of course,
every
we
state.
do know that these did not come out of a box already formed. That they were the process of a lot of input from across the country, lots of states. Each state did have their opportunity to do this, so it isn't come out of nowhere. Tom, the Ontario students have been doing this for quite a while. The Ontario schools are testing very well on the international scale. So let's look in our crystal balls and say, okay, that if in another 10 years, if we stick with that, where are we going to be here in New York State in terms of our students' ability to be competitive globally, to be ready for the jobs and the demands of the 21st century? And in a globally competitive society, are our students going to rank up there competitively with the students of other nations?
Yeah, again, there's nothing to suggest that wouldn't happen if we pull out these commonalities that Tucker and others have identified. It's worked in these other places. We can't just adopt things lockstep and not make local adjustments and adjust for our culture and our, I think there is probably a certain percentage that, states will want to say, well, we need a certain percentage that goes towards New York State history or would reflect local communities. But I still think we can get there with common standards, common framework. you know, look, the past, I'm a history teacher, so the past informs the future, so does the present. We're all on a continuum, and we know what the standards look like now. The Canadians do extremely well. You know, when you look at that most recent iteration of the PISA exam, the overall composite, they're 8th, we're tied for 17th. They are performing very well. And actually, when you take Ontario out, because that's one of the neat things about the PISA, you can pull out your state and rank your state versus other countries versus other states. And so actually, Canada does very well. But when you pull out Ontario, they do even better. You know, that pushes them up near Finland, further to the top of the heap. In fact, when we were at the Rock-Carrier Elementary School, they've had teams from Finland come over and visit.
Wow.
Well, that says a lot.
So, it does say a lot, yes.
Yeah. So we've been very pleased. Like I said, we wanted to get over there, and I think we've struck up a very nice partnership. They ended up, we visited there last January. They ended up sending some folks over in May, and they visited Colton Pierpont and Parishville Hopkinton in a day, and then the next day they went to Madrid-Waddington and visited our Northwest Technical Center in Ogdensburg. They did a presentation for school board members and administrators at the BOCES facility in Canton during the evening. We have struck up a principals academy, 2 different cohorts, new principals, veteran principals, with Bill Collins at St. Lawrence University. And Bill is taking both of those cohort groups on separate days over to Ottawa Carleton. Nicole Turpan, who is an amazing principal at Rock-Carrier, she came over and presented at our Principals Academy. So it's turned out to be quite a partnership, and I think we're going to see constantly sort of visits back and forth. Why not? They're right there. It's just such a tremendous opportunity to learn from one another.
That's right. Tom, I hate to say it, but our time is up, and this has been a fascinating conversation, and we have learned a lot. And I think it's given people who watch this will get a real sense of where we can go if we let it go to completion, so thank you. Our time is up. These conversations are a production of Northcountry Matters, produced here in the studios of WCKN on the campus of Clarkson University. This show is a civic collaboration between the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, and the Communication and Media Department here at Clarkson. Until next time, remember, our Northcountry matters.